Hello, everyone. I'm Vic Armstrong, Vice President for Health Equity and Engagement with the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. And we are extremely happy to be having this conversation today on the campus of St. Augustine's University about mental health and suicide in the black community. I'm very fortunate to be joined by some esteemed panelists today, and I'm going to have them introduce themselves in just a moment. But before we do that, I just want to share a little bit of information with you about who we are and about why this conversation is so important. The American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, for those of you who are not familiar with us, we are the nation's largest suicide prevention organization with chapters in all 50 states, plus Washington, D.C. and Puerto Rico. We're also the world's largest private funder of suicide prevention research. That gives us access to more information, gives us access to more people, and helps us to have a different type of understanding about the plight of suicide and and the need for suicide prevention throughout this country. Over the last several years, we've seen a rapid increase in suicide in the black and African American community. The U.S. black population experienced an 18.8% increase in age-adjusted suicide rates between 2018 and 2021. In 20 to 29-year-olds, the suicide rate increased 42% from 2020 to 2021. And in 15 to 29-year-olds, the suicide rate increased 39.1% from 20 to 21, from 2020 to 2021, and that is in the black community. And for 10 to 14-year-old blacks, the suicide rate increased 3.9%, and that's 10 to 14-year-olds increased 3.9% from 2020 to 2021. And all the while this increase has been occurring, we've been hesitant to have these conversations in the black community, and there's been a lack of conversation resources that speak specifically to the black experience in America and take into account the nuances of race, culture, and ethnicity as it pertains to mental health and suicide prevention. So we're here today to have a very candid conversation, and hopefully we'll share some things that will encourage someone who may have lost hope or social connection. As I mentioned, I'm joined by three esteemed panelists today, and I'll give them each an opportunity to introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about why this conversation is so important to them. I'm going to start with Mr. Keon Lewis, so I'm going to start from the other end and we'll work our way back this way.
Thank you, Vic. Good morning, everyone. I bring you greetings on behalf of the North Carolina chapter of the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, where I currently have the privilege of serving as the board chair. I also serve as a proud member of Omega Psi Phi Fraternity Incorporated. And in 2015, 2016, during that fiscal year, we launched the Brother You're on My Mind Mental Health Initiative. And the idea behind that was to talk about the impacts of depression and stress and anxiety, while also making sure that brothers, families, and community members took the opportunity to utilize the resources that they needed in the event of a crisis, but to also make sure that we partnered up with organizations who shared the same ideals. So as a black man and as someone who didn't realize how much it impacted me until I became an advocate and a volunteer for AFSP, how much this subject matter was around me. And as I grew and matriculated through my leadership roles and positions with AFSP and through Omega Psi Phi, I began to learn that as I became an advocate and spoke out about the importance of mental wellness and suicide prevention, I began to learn about family members and friends, fraternity brothers, classmates, colleagues, you name it, who felt more comfortable in sharing with me their stories and their plight and the things that they were still dealing with, and how it was very comforting to see someone in my position to stand up and advocate for that. And so that's what brings me here today. And so that's why this conversation is important, because whether we believe it or not, or whether we acknowledge it, the conversation around suicide prevention, mental wellness, and diagnosis, there's an invisible thread that ties to us all. And the idea is that by having more dialogue around this, we can be smarter in the way we converse about it, but also make sure that ourselves and our communities, our families, are knowledgeable of the resources that we can access.
Good morning, everyone. I am Dr. Sonia Richardson. I'm an assistant professor in the School of Social Work at UNC Charlotte, and I also am the owner of Another Level Counseling and Consultation, which is one of the longest Black women-owned mental health agencies in Charlotte, North Carolina. So why am I here, and why do I study Black youth suicide? So I come from a family. I grew up with two parents. I was raised in a two-parent household. I have three older siblings, and as a child, I witnessed two of my siblings attempt suicide. I witnessed it. And then what happened? They attempted suicide. One received medical care, went to the hospital, came back home. We went to church. We prayed about it. The other sibling attempted suicide, and we had a discussion, and we went about our business. Nothing happened. They received no care. Then when I went to college, graduated from college, I'm a member of Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated. And one of my sorors, a friend of mine, who I went to church with every Sunday, she always smiled. My kids called her Smiles. She died by suicide. And it was then, after these experiences and having personal experiences with them, with suicide, that I devoted my life to, in my career now, to really studying Black youth suicide. So I'm an interventionist. I create suicide prevention and detection interventions for Black communities. So I am on a mission to create some of the first evidence-based suicide prevention interventions for Black communities, and I'll talk to you a little bit more about that as we progress. But it's a pleasure to be here. I'm so glad you each are here, and I do believe that every single person that's listening in is meant to be here, and I hope that some of the words that we say will inspire you and allow you to continue to be an advocate for this topic as well.
Good morning. I am Louis Keenan McLean Lowndes, the 10th Mr. St. Augustine's University. I was born and raised in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. And it is important for me to be here today to be able to bring back tools to my college campus, St. Augustine's University, and be able to have these tough conversations on where our mental health might not be the best. We go through classes, we go through activities, we go through family struggles. And it is important that we have clear conversations on how our mental health affects us on a daily.
So thank you all so much. So obviously, you can see I did not exaggerate about having an esteemed panel here. And I want to start, Keenan, if we could, with you, because a lot of the data that we shared initially was really about the increase in suicide rates among young Black Americans. And as you stated, you're a college student, born and raised here in North Carolina. Can you talk a little bit about what are some of the challenges that you see that you feel like may be unique to young people these days, and some of the stressors that you see that may be causing some of this, if not the elevated rate in suicide, at least the elevated rate of stress and anxiety with college-age students?
Thank you. That's a good question. I would definitely say that it would be the amount of pressure put on college students, especially first-generation college students. They have so much pressure to just finish college, but also now that we have social media, just comparing ourselves daily to the other person next to us, thinking that we're not doing enough, thinking that we aren't enough, and we are. Everybody's paths are different, and we have to understand that. But that takes a toll on our mental health just because that we don't know how to navigate this college thing. Is a new thing for us, and it's very important for us to lean on each other and just have these conversations, and we have to be able to make a change for us and our mental health.
Thank you for that. Now that raises another question for me, and Dr. Richardson, I'm going to put this question to you, because one of the things that Keenan just mentioned was that part of the pressure for young people comes from comparing themselves to other people. You have social media, and there are these social media comparisons, and you're kind of held to a standard that may not always be a realistic standard. But you know, when I was growing up, the conversation was that you're Black, you are resilient, you should be able to overcome anything. Your forefathers survived slavery, so we should be able to survive anything, which was also an unrealistic standard. So we were being compared to something then that was unrealistic, that was putting additional stressors on us. Can you talk a little bit from your research about where some of the, first of all, what some of the stigma comes from with some of the older generation, but then from your perspective, what are you seeing about the impact of social media and some of the stressors that are being put on young people today?
So that's a lot. But great dialogue and great question, Victor. So a couple of things that I want to point out for you. One is when you talked about this continuous pressure, it brings back, of course, John Henryism, the idea that as Black people, we work and we work and we work and we work and we work harder and harder and harder, and we're always trying to prove something. And then guess what? We prove it, and what do? We work harder and harder and harder, and now we're trying to prove the next thing. And it's a continuous cycle that affects our mental health. We have to get to the point in our lives where it's no longer that I need to prove to anybody else. It's about what can I prove to myself. I don't need to prove to anybody else. I don't need to show I'm the best, I'm the smartest, I'm the wisest. I don't need to do that. I just need to be me, and I need to show up the way that I need to show up. And so I challenge you to do that, because oftentimes when you go into the social media lane, in my research, I had some recent publications that came out, and I studied Black youth suicide. And in the publications looked at a national sample of high school students and middle school students. And actually the rates of suicide, suicidality, which is ideation, having thoughts about suicide, a plan or attempts, those rates are actually higher among our Black middle school students than our high school students. And so it's even trickling down to the middle school students. But this is what's happening, and this is what's different for them versus our generation growing up. So social media, what's happening is the kids are going to school, and I think based on my research, approximately 25-30% are experiencing bullying at school. So you go to school, you get bullied, and guess what? You go home, now you're on social media, and there's cyberbullying. You don't get a break from bullying. It's continuous bullying day in and day out for some populations and some of us. And those rates of bullying are really high among the Black population. So when it comes to comparison, the comparison is also about you hearing those messages, or people are, saying something on your timelines, or they're saying something on social media, and now you're starting to question yourself, or you're seeing those different things. As far as tips and tools and strategies for each one of you, I would suggest for you to really monitor when do you start to feel shifts happen within you. So for me, for social media, when I start to feel a certain kind of way, or I find myself starting to compare people, or I'm questioning, am I doing enough? It's time for me to come off social media. That means that something has now gotten into my mind, into my spirit, and it's making me think I need to do something different or prove something, and so I take those breaks. Allow yourself to take those breaks, because what's happening and what I see in the research is we're wearing ourselves out, and we're not taking those breaks. Now, let me tell you one last thing, and I'll give it back to Vic. Where does all of this come from? So when we think about the need for us to constantly prove ourselves over and over, where does this come from? When we look at the history of mental health in this country, if we go back to the 1700s, there were mental health diagnoses for enslaved Black people for when we did express emotions. So when our Black women, Black mothers had their babies ripped away from them and taken from them, they were stolen and kidnapped. If they grieved, then they were given a diagnosis, because we weren't supposed to feel anything. We weren't supposed to have emotions as Black people. And the reason why is because we were not human. It was a process of us going through dehumanization, where there was a need to dehumanize us in order to allow us to be enslaved. And so if you go back to hundreds of years ago, there was this process of we're not supposed to feel. So now when we go out in public and people are like, what's up, how you doing? You're like, oh, I'm doing good, but you ain't doing good. And guess why you're saying that? Because we've been trained not to show and have emotion. And so now as a population, it's okay, like we need to feel. We need to allow ourselves to say when we're not well, when something's not right. We need to be willing to call out stuff and deal with what happens with that. We do have a voice, but our reason and how we got here today is partly because of the dehumanization that we went through. And we are human, and we do feel, and things you say do hurt. And the way that you look at me, I do see it. And so we need to call some of those things out to protect our wellness.
So, Dr. Richardson, you touched on several really key points there. You know, when you start the conversation about John Henryism, the first thing that my mind went to was that role of the strong black male, that we're not supposed to show pain, that we're not supposed to show vulnerability. Being raised myself by a preacher. My father was a pastor, pastored for 48 years. And he was one that always taught me that there was a certain way you were supposed to carry yourself as a male. And I know a lot of that impacts the way that we internalize our own wellness, our own mental wellness, and how we show up. So I wanna pose this question both to Keenan and to Keon as black males, and I'm going to start Keenan with you, if I may. You are young black man, Mr. St. Aug, got everything in the world going for you. So clearly, you don't have to be having this conversation. And when I reached out to you about being a part of this conversation, there was no hesitation. What is it that makes this conversation important to you as a black male, a young black man, to be talking to other people about the importance of mental wellness? And then, Keon, I'm going to ask you if you would follow up by talking a little bit about what it is like as a black man navigating society and then really trying to cope with these mixed messages that we receive about mental well-being.
And it's so crazy that you say I have everything going for myself, because I actually feel like I'm not doing enough. I feel like sometimes I'm behind. I feel like sometimes I could be doing more. And I have to remind myself that I am enough every day, actually. And this position puts me in a crazy place where even when I'm feeling down, I have to put on a mask and I have to go around and be Mr. St. Aug. And some days I'm just not for it. Some days I want to just stay in my room. Some days I just want to have my alone time. And I do have that time set apart where I can just be in my own space. But honestly, being a black man, it's hard. Growing up, it was just me and my mom. My grandma really helped us a lot. I didn't have a father figure in my life, so my mom had to be my mom and my dad. And so with that, going through with that, my mom wasn't always nurturing to a fact that she couldn't be. She had to be that stern person. She had to be that dad figure that I needed so badly. And looking back, that I didn't appreciate when I was younger, but now that I appreciate that because she was able to play both roles. And her situation has grown, and I've grown because of the sacrifices that she made. So to all my black men, I just say, just be your authentic self. You don't have to wear that mask all the time. You have to find somebody that you can speak to and somebody that you can confide in, because it's important that we do not hold stuff in our hearts. We can't hold that in because we have to release. At some point, you need to release before it turns into something bad, and you just don't want that negative thoughts clouding your perception of who you really are.
Yeah, that's good. Thank you for that, Keenan. And so, myself, piggybacking on your point, Vic, just as a black man now, it's a lot. It's a lot of factors that intersect together. It's a lot of dynamics. And so one of the first things that I look at as to why this conversation is necessary, why it's important, why I should be present in these rooms, in these spaces, and in this level of advocacy, is for young kings like Keenan to be able to remind them that you are enough, and it's okay to not be okay. And as someone who has, endured it in my young years in college and now enduring it as a graduate student, to let them know, hey, you are doing great things, and to continue to push them, but don't push them too hard, and let them know that it's all right to be vulnerable in those moments. It's all right to seek counseling. It's all right to talk about those things that you're experiencing, because a lot of us are experiencing it the same way. To hear his story, and even though this is our first time meeting, I share that exact same story, because I was raised by my grandmother until the age of 13. And I wasn't in the house with my father until I was a teenager. So you're talking about literally at most 4.5, 5 years that I had time with my father to get groomed, to become a man, to go to college. So it was a lot of hard lessons that came in that. It was a lot of, hey, you got to be tough, suck it up moments. And it wasn't until years later Now, as a father and as a husband and as a leader and as a mentor, now we're coming back, we're looking back on those conversations and say, you know what? I should have been a little more empathetic in those moments, or I should have said this, I should have done that. And I hope and I pray I wasn't too hard on you because I wanted you to be prepared. I wanted you to do these things. So yeah, it's complex. It's difficult. And then when you throw in these dynamics of, a lot of times going into these professional spaces where you may be the only black man in that role, or you may be the only one or the first to have held a position. Even now I serve as the board chair for AFSP. I'm the first black male to hold that role. So there comes a level of pressure, a level of expectation, and a lot of it is what I put on myself to adhere to that. And so it takes conversations like these. It takes me going to the likes of the Victor Armstrongs of the world to say, hey, bro, I need your help on this. What are your thoughts? And to give me those reminders, hey, you're good, you're doing good. Be your authentic self. You don't have to overdo it. It's okay to give a little bit here, a little bit there, but just finding that balance. So one of the things that I try to make sure that I endure, and just as Keena stated, is to make sure I recognize when I'm doing too much, to be honest, to be transparent in those moments, set aside time for myself, get the mental health resources that are available for me, whether it's through counseling, through exercise, eating healthy, talking amongst bros, talking amongst friends, community activism, but just making sure that I'm being my authentic self and that I'm capable of recognizing that I am enough and that there's still more for me to learn, but just knowing that I'm not alone in this race.
So thank you both for those perspectives. This is sometimes a very difficult balancing act, I think, for me as a black man. And as I mentioned, growing up in a household where my father was really that strong, silent type. My father was not an affectionate type. My father, though he was being a pastor, he was someone that people really looked up to in the community. So I was always very proud of my father. He was a loving father, and he was home every night, but he brought me up and taught me to be a certain way. And now as a father myself and someone who's raising black sons, I recognize that I have to raise them differently. There's a very delicate balance sometimes to trying to be that nurturing, and Keenan, you spoke about with your mother, but even as a man, trying to be that nurturing father and expressing vulnerability to black boys and letting them know it's okay to be vulnerable. It's okay to admit when you're hurting, but at the same time, helping them to understand that the world sometimes looks at you differently and that sometimes you do have to work harder. Sometimes you do have to show up differently. Sometimes you don't get a second opportunity to make mistakes. And so it's a very delicate balance to try to prepare them for a world that sometimes assigns characteristics and qualities to them that are not who they are, but at the same time, giving them the vulnerability to be able to embrace who they are. So I guess I say that to say, and Dr. Richardson, I like to put hard questions to you. So I'm going to put this back to you, and in part with the research that you are, what you're finding now in the communities that you're working with, what are we doing right in that space of trying to prepare our next generation? And then what are we missing that we should be doing differently? And even in the research, what are things that you're learning that maybe we were misinformed about?
All right, so I'm going to start with what are we doing wrong? So what are we doing wrong? And one thing that we have found in our research, so right now, just to give you context, I have a National Institutes of Mental Health grant where we are creating one of the first Black youth care coordination interventions to prevent suicide among Black youth. So we've worked with the local Charlotte community, and the Charlotte community, the Black youth, Black parents, Black community members, and Black healthcare providers have helped us to re-envision a care coordination intervention, and we're now testing it in the Black community right now it's an open trial and it's going to a randomized clinical trial. What have we already learned in the last year and a half with this funding? The main thing, my main takeaway, and I'm currently writing this up for publication, It does not matter what evidence-based intervention and practice you use. If you do not first humanize Black populations when you work with them, the intervention and the evidence-based practice is not going to work. So I'm focused on creating a humanizing first approach. And what I mean by that is this. We have this great intervention, right? We have this intervention for Black youth that are suicidal, who have experienced suicide in the last 90 days. It's free, we're offering it, and as we're talking to the community, talking to different systems, everybody's like, okay, that sounds good, but we don't know if these Black families are gonna respond to this. We don't know if the parents are really invested. And then we heard things like, well, the children come to the hospitals because they wanna get away from their parents, because they don't wanna be home with their Black parents. We're hearing all this feedback during our qualitative study that was so dehumanizing of Black people. So when it comes to us getting well, if you don't even see us as human, how are you gonna help us to become well? And so first, what I'm focused on is creating a humanizing first approach where you recognize the humanness within me. So if you sending me to a therapist and they're trying to then do this evidence-based practice with me, but they hadn't even engaged with me, they haven't even recognized that for me as a Black woman, it's hard for me living in this society, and with everything going on with the recent deaths of Black women, that I'm not okay. Like, if you're not recognizing my humanness as a Black person, I don't want your intervention. I don't want your evidence-based practice. I need you to see me as human. So that's what we're getting wrong. We're not humanizing. And the places that we're sending people have not been trained to see us as people because we've gone through this systemic cycle of dehumanization. Okay, so that's what we've gotten wrong. What are we getting right? In the Black community, this is what happened, y'all. So when it comes to like different health diagnoses and conditions, for decades and decades, in the Black population, we had the lowest rates of suicide. We went through everything we went through in this society, all of the torture, all of the lynchings, we went through all of that, right? And we still had the lowest rates of suicide. We learned how to survive all of the trauma that we went through. And then the last couple of decades, our rates have now just taken off and they have increased. And everybody's trying to figure out what's wrong, what happened. Part of what I want you to think about is back in the 1930s, one of the first Black suicide researchers said, as Black people become more acculturated in this country and lose their African roots and values, that they're gonna have higher rates of suicide. This was back in the 1930s. What do we need to get right? We got to return back to what works for our community, and we got to return back to what our ancestors said we need to do. We got to return back to this collectivism. We got to stop focusing on me, and focus on us, which is why we're having this panel today. We got to focus on our collective healing. If I'm not well, you're not well. If you're not well, I'm not well. It's not about me. It's about us. And so we got to return to that. And so there is now some funding to fund the work that, like what I'm doing, that's focused on Black communities and creating interventions just for Black communities. We gotta create some stuff for us, by us, because we know, our ancestors know what we need and what we need to heal. So that would be my thoughts.
So thank you for that. Now you mentioned in your response that part of it is returning to kind of who we are, returning to who we are as a people, who we are in our roots in the community. And one of the things that has always been a part of the Black community is kind of the gateway to the community has been the faith-based community. And I know that over the past several years, there's been much lower rates of attendance in faith-based organizations. But I'm curious, and I would pose this question to each of you. I'd like to start, Dr. Richardson, with when you think about returning to our roots, what role does our spirituality play? What role should our spirituality play? But then I'd also like to put the question to Keon and to Keenan as well about what your perspectives are on what role our spirituality should play in our mental well-being. But Dr. Richardson, I want to start with you.
So as far as our spirituality, the intervention work that I do is partnered with faith-based communities. And what we have learned from the Black community is that there is a higher level of trust for faith communities, but there is not the desire to necessarily have mental health services in the church. So the interventions that we've created are not in the church, but we're associated with the church. What is the role of spirituality in the Black communities? Spirituality is foundational to Black communities. Spirituality is not religion, though. Spirituality is foundational. And I think we've gotten that confused with religion and these habitual practices and things. I think we have to return back to the foundation of spirit, connection to ancestors, and things like that.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, Dr. Richardson. And then, going back to your point, Vic, of, growing up in a household where, your grandmother made sure you went to church, vacation Bible school, traveling. So it was always a intricate foundation, in my life and growing up with that, and the importance of spirituality and saying that utilize it as your guide. I was always being told, hey, you develop your relationship with God. I can't tell you what it should look like. I can't tell you what it should feel like. And so you need to establish that. And that's one of those things that, growing up as a man and growing up as a husband, a father, a brother, a mentor, and a friend is finding, number one, what does my relationship look like from a spirituality standpoint? And then number two, how do I infuse that into my everyday walk? Into the way I live, the way I breathe, the way I serve. And so, yeah, it plays an enormous role. And the idea is that even with that, just as Dr. Richardson stated, mental health and suicide prevention, those things was never a part of that ministry in churches. Not until most recently now you have individuals within the church where you're making it more comfortable to discuss. But it was always one of those things where they say, hey, pray this demon away and, get in your corner. And, we got prayer warriors for you. But there was never the real conversation to say, hey, you know what? You need some help. You need some counseling. You need services. Let me direct you in this direction. Or I know of a counseling center, or I know of an agency that can support you. So, yeah, it is a very intricate part of my process. It is embedded within me, but it is also the thing that kind of the deeply rooted foundation in which guides me, but should also be the thing that reminds me, hey, faith without works is dead. And so as much as I lean on that, I also need to be cognizant of being able to get the help that I need, supporting others, and allowing it to be a foundational element instead of being a thing that totally dictates the way I function and the way I think.
First of all, I just want to thank God. Jesus Christ is my Lord and Savior, and all of my accomplishments are His. None of my works are of myself. And every day, I start my day with devotion, and it really opens my heart just for me to be able to just live my life through love and through my heart. And that's just been so foundational for me, because for a long time I just felt like I was lost and I didn't have that guiding light. And like you said, when you have problems and like you go to church members, therapists are not, it has like a bad connotation with the ring of it, and I don't know why. Because like you said, like prayer without works is dead, and if you're not working on yourself, you're not going to a professional, then you're not going to be able to see the results that you're actually looking for.
So, in listening to all of your comments around spirituality, and Dr. Richardson, to your point about there being a difference in spirituality and religion, and I agree. I think that's a place where we've gotten it confused to the point where there are a lot of people that I have engaged with who will tell you, because part of what I do too with American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, we have a workshop called Soul Shop for Black Churches, which is a workshop that works with Black faith leaders on how to talk about suicide in their congregations and how to minister to people in their congregations who may be hurting. And a lot of people will tell you that a lot of their trauma, a lot of their emotional damage has come from engagement with the faith-based community. That oftentimes faith leaders did not know what to do with them when they were experiencing mental health challenges, and actually ended up causing them more pain, or that faith leaders didn't know what to do with them if they identified as, as LGBTQ, and it caused them more pain and trauma. And I say that in part because I grew up in a very small community, so my world was very small. A lot of things that I was taught, some of them are very strong values that I still carry with me today. They helped to sustain me in a lot of ways, but there were also a lot of things that I had to disengage myself from because they were very narrow ways of thinking, very narrow ways of looking at things. And as I learned more about life and about the world in general, my thinking broadened, and I think of things differently. And now I'm at a place where I'm trying to go back and really trying to re-engage my community, but re-engage my community differently. So my question to you, and Keon, I want to start with you on this because we've done a lot of work in trying to build communities, build up communities, and especially in the conversation on suicide prevention. But I want to ask you, how can we engage our communities? How can communities get involved? How can we reach into our own relationships and help to build out this conversation?
Yeah, thank you for that, Vic, and also I want to thank you for all of those opportunities I've had the chance to join you in being a part of advancing this dialogue, advancing this mission, and this important and vital cause. And I would say, the first step is starting at home. Starting at home, having those conversations, as difficult as they may be, whether you're doing it at dinner, doing it at a family reunion, cookout, one-on-one with family members, and just building that level of comfort with being, transparent about one's mental health, one's spirituality, and the dynamics that it has on you. But then I'll, fast forward and then I look at it from a collaboration standpoint. Who are the organizations that we need to collaborate with, whether we're doing it through our churches, our fraternities, our sororities, our faith-based leadership organizations, community associations, is finding the right group of individuals to be able to share that space with, to have that dialogue, and then aligning ourselves with other organizations like AFSP and like MHA and NAMI and et cetera, to see what does that dynamic look like and what type of materials exist that we can bring to our communities and learn from it, and also find ways to develop that. And then lastly, after you've looked at the things that you've done within your home, within your community, within other organizational and affiliations, also looking at introspectively yourself, trying to see what that looks like, what that growth looks like within yourself, and whether you're doing that through counseling and research and reading self-help books, exercise, all those different things. There's a lot of unique ways that we can engage, and I say that primarily it starts at home, and then from there you branch out and you grow on it.
As far as engaging our community, I'm involved with a couple of initiatives. We're really trying to figure out how to detect suicide in the Black community. And so have some work now with Dr. Rodney Harris, who I believe is based out of Wake County. But he's been able to get 30 barbers, Black barbers, trained on mental health first aid. And so we're creating a partnership now between the barbers and the faith leaders, because we have community health workers at the churches that can link Black people to resources and services. But we're trying to figure out, where do we detect when Black people are at risk for suicide, because we're not detecting it at the right time. It's detected when they go to the hospital and they're saying they're suicidal. That's too late. We need to figure out the early warning signs. And so we're training people in the community to have influence to identify people in the community who are at risk, so we can provide some preventive measures in place and get them the help that they need before it becomes a crisis. Typically, when people are coming to me for counseling, it's at crisis. And we would love to do more preventive work. So I would say, from the community perspective, we got to figure out who are the influencers in the community, how can we get them trained on how to detect suicide, and then as they're detecting suicide, who can we safely send them to that's not going to cause harm, that's going to actually help them deal with the issues that they're dealing with and heal and get better and continue that cycle on.
And I would challenge my peers to be proactive. We have excellent services here on campus. We have CAPS, where you can go and talk to a professional about whatever you're dealing with. And also, I just started Falcon Men. This is a group where men can just come into a space and just be vulnerable with one another and just talk about what's going on within their life. And we pose different topics for each week.
So I may want to hear more about that because I think that's phenomenal. And Keenan, you just raised another point because, and Dr. Richardson, I think you and Keon both touched on this as well. Oftentimes when we think about creating resources for Black people, and maybe even more so for Black men, we have this idea about what access to care and access to resources look like. And in large part, terms like access and collaboration and partnership have been industry terms that we've kind of owned as systems in this space. But I think one of the things that we are learning is that access is not just providing physical proximity to the same traditional things. Access really is about creating resources in communities where people live, work, play, and pray. It's about creating resources that are culturally relevant, resources that are relatable to my lived experience. And it's about creating resources that I'm willing to utilize, because if I'm not willing to utilize them, then that's not access for me. So we need to think about access differently. And Keenan, that's one of the things that resonated with me when you just talked about this space that you're creating for males on the campus. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that. And then I'd like to hear both from Dr. Richardson and Keon about their thoughts on what does access need to look like for the Black community.
Well, this space that I created for the men on campus, it started with me and my roommate, Ali DeCosta Paul, and we felt like last semester we just wasn't getting done what we wanted to do, and so we started sharing our goals each week, and some of them included faith-based work. And I'm Christian and he's Muslim. Even though we're different faith, we still resonated with each other and knew that it's important to us and that it's definitely something vital to our improvement. And so as we started growing together, we reached out to our friends and we created a reflection group where we all just send our reflections each week. And it's just been so powerful for us being able to have a space where we can release and just be vulnerable with one another. And now I wanted to open that up because I know it's been very pivotal for me. So I wanted to open up for the men on campus where they can just have a safe space where we can just have a conversation, because sometimes that's all you need, just a simple conversation and just telling somebody how you feel. And we actually meet today at 3:30, so if any men in here want to be a part of that, that would be great, and I would love to have you. I'm hoping this is something that we can keep going, because this space has just been so great for me and my friends, and I just can't wait to see where it grows into.
I definitely agree with everything that you said, Keenan. And in our research with Black communities and Black youth in particular, what we found is that in our community, there was preference for non-professional supports over paid professional supports. So for example, when our youth were experienced, Black youth were experiencing suicide, they preferred to be connected to a mentor versus going to a therapist. And so when I think about access, I'm thinking about access along that whole continuum of mental health. Mental health for the Black community does not start with a therapist. Mental health for the Black community starts with somebody in that community. It might start with a mentor. It might start with a coach. It might start with any of that. And so as you're thinking about your well-being, I challenge you, when you think about your access and what you have access to, think about who's already in your circle. I would say to evaluate who's in your circle, because sometimes access to mental health and access to you getting better is you getting rid of some people out of your circle. That's access. You got to get rid of some things. So assess who's in your circle, and then if I assess who's in my circle, are they giving me what I need, or do I need to go find some other supports to support me through this journey? So I just connected with Ashley today. We connected on LinkedIn. We're now in the circle together. Okay, so me and Ashley are in the circle. Me and you gonna be in the circle too, because I got to connect with you. But these are people in the circle, and these are people that help us to keep each other well. And so it's not always about When you have mental health issues, go see a therapist. Yes, sometimes go see a therapist. And I would say most importantly, assess who you already have access to and what resources are here. If you're a student and you're here and you have CAPS, I used to work at Johnson C. Smith. I was their director of counseling. It's free counseling services. You get free services while you're a student. Go get your counseling. Experience it. See what it's like. And it's probably a black counselor, I'm thinking. Okay. Yeah, so you got a black counselor. Go see somebody here that's black and get access. That's access. You got access. You got to use it.
Yeah, I love two incredible points that y'all both make. First, with creating space, creating that platform to be able to be comfortable, be transparent, and to be able to share it. And also, some sense of discretion in knowing and understanding that, hey, when we have these conversations, you're not going to go out here and blast out, what we discussed, and I trust you with that. And then to piggyback on your point, Dr. Richardson, about, utilizing that inner circle, those people that you trust, that you already know. And so to piggyback on both of those points, when I think about access, I'm thinking about it from the knowledge and the information that's shared. And so not to, get too far ahead on what Vic is going to be doing later on today and talking about, Let's Save Lives, I think about educational programs like that we offer through AFSP. And what Let's Save Lives is talking about the Black community, is talking about what we're experiencing from the scope of the historical context on down to what we're seeing present day. And so when I think about being a part of those presentations and sharing that knowledge, a lot of it is, number one, being able to acknowledge when there is a problem and recognizing that whether you're dealing with it personally or you have a close friend or someone within that inner circle, and also acknowledging that there are resources available. And so in that particular presentation, we're talking about those resources that are available. How do you access CAPS? How do you access your EAP programs at work? What are some local resources in your community that you may not have been aware of? Or what are the websites where you can go to find a Black counselor that you can do in person or virtually? And so when I think about access, I'm thinking about the knowledge and information that I share with people who may not have been aware that these things existed and these resources existed. And so that when they walk away not only with the knowledge to make themselves better or to be able to share with others, but they feel empowered to be able to have these types of conversations and not feel as if that they can't be themselves, they can't be transparent, or that they have to shy away from it because of how uncomfortable it is.
And I know for me, also being a college student, like you said, making sure that your network is supporting you. And some friends don't offer the same things. Sometimes you have to, sort through your friends and put them in different filing cabinets. Some friends you might talk about sports with, some friends you might talk about relationship with, and some friends you might talk about like your spirituality. And so just making sure that you have roles for different people, because not everybody has that same capacity that you do or can talk about what you can talk about. But they're still your friends, though.
Thank you so much. And you see why I keep Dr. Richardson and Keon in my circle, and now Keenan, you're in my circle too. So I want us to start to wrap this conversation up. But one of the things that I know people are probably wondering is, how do you know when someone is struggling? How do you know when someone is expressing symptoms that they may be suicidal? And so, Dr. Richardson, I want to ask you, can you share with us what are some of the risks and warning signs that we should be looking for? And then how should we respond?
So when you think about risk factors for suicide, and I'll do this from a Black perspective, you're thinking about like changes in behavior. So you might have someone who was hanging out and you always see them on campus, and they're going to different events, and then all of a sudden you don't see them around. They've kind of isolated themselves, and let's say that they're not online for like a fraternity or sorority, but they are not around and they're starting to isolate themselves. When you see changes in behavior, that can be a warning sign. That's a sign just to check in to make sure somebody's okay. When there's changes in nonverbals, so maybe they were loud and talking a lot, and now they've gotten real quiet and reserved. When there's changes in like those nonverbals, and those verbals, you want to pay attention to that. When people start to give away things, so I've often seen that. A lot of times people will say, hey, you want this jacket or you want this pair of shoes? And it was their favorite pair of sneakers. Like that's usually a warning sign. When sometimes people will present as if everything is like really, really okay. And so they're super happy, but they're not really happy. They're really sad deep down inside. So when you see changes in emotions. So I would say really pay attention to changes in people. And you can really ask them the question, hey, I noticed you've been changing a little bit lately. You all right? You good? You can ask them those questions. And then they might say, yeah, I'm good. And then you might say, but are you really good? Like follow that up with that, but are you really good? And ask them those questions. So you're looking for some of those warning signs. With our youth, they often say that they change their behaviors and nobody recognizes that they're showing up differently. Nobody even recognizes that they're different. So even when I don't, and even when I'm not myself and I'm not showing up and I'm not engaged and I'm not talking, y'all still ain't asking about me. And so really noticing those things and just checking in on your people.
Yeah, and I would also say, pay attention to the talk, pay attention to the language. And now that we're in this social media space, pay attention to when those posts suddenly just stop, especially someone who you see they posting stories, tweets, threads, Instagram stories on the regular, and then all of a sudden it just cuts off. Like it's one thing if it cuts off for a day. It's another thing if it cuts off for a couple of days. But if it's all of a sudden weeks at a time, and they're not traveling outside of the country or some other dynamics, those are the kind of things that you kind of let that alarm go off to say, hey, let me check in, let me tap in and make sure my brother or my sister, my friend is okay, because those are some of the things that let you know that something has changed, whether it was a crisis or a series of events that have led them to that. These are just some of the many different things that you want to pay attention to and recognize that their behaviors have shifted, the way they talk, the way they even reference themselves. I know one of the things that we talk about in different presentations and educational materials that we offer through FSP, we talk about the dynamics of individuals who often feel suicidal or going through the thought of it is not feeling like they're not enough or they don't bring anything towards community. So even in a simple conversation, if someone just simply says, oh, if I was to leave today, would anybody care? Things of that nature. Those are those warning signs to become proactive and to begin asking those questions. Just as Dr. Richardson stated, are you really all right? Like, hey, let's talk. Let's walk and talk this thing out. Let's go break bread. But these are just some of the things that you recognize in the tone and the behavior and the body language. There's a lot of different ways that we can recognize that, and the key is knowing when something is outside of that norm, but also having the courage to ask those questions and to make sure that your friend or your colleague is doing all right.
So before we close this panel out, I want to give each of you an opportunity, if you have any parting thoughts, anything you want to share and maybe something that's come to you as we've been having this conversation, a question I did not ask you, or may just be some words of encouragement you want to leave with our listeners. And Keenan, we'll start with you.
My last and final words would be is that I trust St. Augustine's University. St. Augustine's University have gave me so much, and the community here is just something that I value so much, and I can't believe, and it's honestly indescribable just the way that this community has shaped me as a person, as the man I am today. And I know we're going to a struggling time, but we will prevail. Falcons will always and will keep on soaring forever.
My last word would be for each one of you to not lose hope. Sometimes I read a book recently and it talked about how sometimes as Black people, this is by Austin Channing, she says, sometimes as Black people, we live in the shadow of hope. So we maintain hope and sometimes we're in that shadow. So sometimes it just feels like we just can't get to where we want to get, but maintain hope. Our ancestors maintained hope. They went through what they went through. We're going through what we're going through. You all are going through what you're going through. But maintain hope. It will get better. And there are people and resources that want to help you to guide through this. I will leave you with 988. It's the suicide prevention hotline. It's a free number. You can call like 911, but it's 988. You can call that and talk to a trained counselor at any time, 24 hours a day. There's also Black Line. Black Line is also a suicide prevention hotline, mental health promotion hotline for Black people. So if you don't want to call 988 and you want to make sure you talk to a Black person, you can call Black Line. So there's also resources where you don't have to go into anybody's office or ask anybody for help. You just pick up the phone and call, or you can even text 988. So I would leave you with those resources. So maintain hope, y'all. It always gets better. It always. We always go through something, and we always come out, and it gets better.
Yeah, and for my parting message, I want to leave this for our young leaders that's in this room, that you are the future. And one of the things that I learned from my executive coach, Dr. Lewis, ironically enough, and he shared with me, we got on the conversation about mental health and suicide prevention and the importance of mental wellness. And he told me something very profound in that moment. He said, often as individuals growing in our career and our profession, and as we try to reach these new levels, one of the first things that often gets sacrificed is our self-care. And so I want to remind you and tell don't let that be your sacrificial lamb. Don't sacrifice your self-care. Protect your crown, protect your peace. Take value in what you bring, take value in what you offer to this community, but don't let it come at the expense of your livelihood and your wellness, especially your mental wellness. And so I just want to encourage you to continue to be optimistic, continue to be transformative, have faith in all that you do. You have what it takes. Know when you're doing enough, know when to step away, know when to let go of things, and know when you've pushed yourself too hard. But continue to protect your crown, protect your peace. And I look forward to all the great things that you all plan to do for this community, for this campus, and for the world. And I appreciate this opportunity to be amongst you to share this message.
So I want to thank everyone for being a part of this conversation with us today. Hopefully something that was shared that would encourage you. I do want to encourage anyone who's looking for an opportunity to get involved in your community. American Foundation for Suicide Prevention is an option for you. You can go to afsp.org. You can find information about how to volunteer in your community, how to join a walk, how to support financially. You can find support at afsp.org, and you can find out about our newest program. Keon mentioned that Let's Save Lives. Let's is an acronym for Listening, Empathy, Trust, and Support Saves Lives. It is a program developed specifically by Black people for Black people that takes into account the Black experience and how that impacts our mental well-being. And so I encourage you to also go and look at that. And I will say this in parting, that as I engage in conversation today with this group, it is apparent to me that when I look at the future of suicide prevention, and I look at a leader like Keon, who's one of our board chairs for the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, this work is clearly in good hands. When I look at Dr. Richardson, who is one of our, no longer can I call her an up-and-coming researcher because she has arrived. She's with Keenan, and I listen to the wisdom that this young man speaks with. And when I hear him talk about the things that he's doing to help make life better, not only for himself, but for his community and for his friends, I know the world is in good hands. So to anyone out there today, if you are hurting emotionally, if you are hurting mentally, we want you to be encouraged. We want you to know that you matter, your life matters, your pain matters. You are not alone. We want you to be here tomorrow and every day after that. Thank you.